today for those that haven't been to Hard Earth before. So this is a class that's been going on now for 3 years. And this class was really started to show the awesome research that a lot of grad students here at Stanford are doing, particularly related to environmental problems. So a lot of us, at least in my day-to-day work, I usually focus on one specific aspect of environmental issues, but this problems relating to the environment kind of span the entire gamut of research, from engineering to journalism to law. So what this class does is bring students in from campus, grad students that are doing a lot of this really cool work, and exposes them or their work to a lot of the other students on campus, primarily undergrads, which is why we host this series at the dorm. So for myself, when I was looking to going into grad school, I didn't know that much about it as an undergrad. So being able to talk to grad students and see the kind of work that they do was at least for me really helpful right before I was applying to school. So today I'm happy to welcome Ben Franta. He is both a student at the law school and doing his PhD, so he's very qualified. And I guess I just heard that news came out today that Exxon was fined by the SEC for exactly what Ben's going to talk about. So please welcome Ben.
Thanks a lot. Okay, yeah, thank you for having me. And please, at any time, please get up and get food. Or ask questions. You can ask questions. I'm going to try to keep the talk to about 25 minutes so that we have a lot of time at the end for questions and discussion. But if you have a question in the middle of the talk, please raise your hand and please ask me. You don't want to be distracted by questions that you are wondering about. So, as you just mentioned, so I'm a PhD student in the history department here, and a JD student at the law school. And actually, before I came here, I did another PhD in applied physics. And I was working on climate change, renewable energy research in that. And sort of ironically, at the end of that degree, I wanted to keep working in climate change stuff, but I wanted to do work that was more directly relevant to policy and politics, and not just work on technology. So no matter what you're interested in, or whatever you study, there's a way to work on this issue and contribute to it, which is kind of a nice, it's one of the few nice things about global warming. So I'm going to talk today about my research on what the oil industry knew about global warming, and when they knew it, and how they knew it. And you might have seen, or you may not. Let's see if this works from back here. There we go. People are asking, is ExxonMobil the next Philip Morris? Lawyers are asking that. Politicians are asking that. And other people are asking that. And the reason is that in the last few years, there's been a wave of lawsuits against oil and gas companies for knowing about global warming, denying their knowledge, and spreading disinformation about it. And then now we're seeing the impacts, and the cities and states affected by those impacts, they want to sue and get some money back to help pay for those impacts. So you might have seen San Francisco and Oakland recently just sued the top 5 publicly traded oil companies like ExxonMobil and Shell and BP, for example. And they want those companies to help pay for the damage that will be caused by sea level rise in the Bay Area. And that litigation is still going on. And something that's different about this wave of lawsuits from what came before is that for a long time people have been suing oil companies about environmental harms and climate change. But it's mostly been environmental organizations. It's been nonprofits and NGOs, motivated by desire to help the environment, but not a desire to make profit. But now for the first time, you've got private law firms, very experienced plaintiffs' lawyers that have experience. For example, this is Steve Berman, and his firm did the Volkswagen diesel cheating scandal lawsuit, and then he has a lot of experience in suing big tobacco too, and getting them to pay a lot of money for the harms that their products cause. So they're very experienced lawyers, and they're in it to help the climate, but they're also in it because they think they can win and make a lot of money doing it. And so that changes the game a little bit in the last few years, because you've got lawyers that are haven't been involved with this fight before, and now they're getting involved with this. So I think that's pretty interesting. And in fact, just today, so this is October 24th. Let's see if I get this right here. That's today. New York State just sued ExxonMobil for deceiving its shareholders by lying about climate change and what regulation would do to the company. And so that's just today. And so New York State has been investigating ExxonMobil for the last 3 years about this, and then just today they decided to file and sue them. So they must have found something interesting in the last 3 years. Okay, so if we think about what happened before, the litigation against big tobacco, it kind of had two main parts. It had the epidemiology, which was the measurement of how much harm was being caused by tobacco. That allows you to quantify the damages. And then you have the history of the industry, and that's the history of knowledge and denial and deceit, and that's what creates the moral and the legal culpability that allows you to sue them and say, actually, this is partly your fault, and so you need to pay for it, in part at least. So that's big tobacco litigation, and now this new wave of big fossil litigation, as I call it, is basically the same. It's what's called attribution science, which is something like, okay, there's a big storm. What are the chances, or how much more likely is this storm in a globally warmed world, say, as opposed to if we didn't have any global warming? Say, is it 30% more likely, 50% more likely? And from that, you can figure out how much more damage has been caused, and figure out basically how much did global warming cost in this case. And then you've got the history again. So it's really similar. And of course, nobody knows if this strategy will work, but it eventually worked in the case of big tobacco. And so that's why people are thinking this will work for climate change too. So just to do a little pop quiz, get everybody involved. I want you to just read this and tell me which year you think this was written in. Yeah, what do you think?
Very, very rough guess. Like 1970, 1960s?
Okay, 1970s or 1960s. What else? Any other guesses? Yeah.
1980s, 1982.
Okay, 1982. I like the precision. Any other guesses? Later, earlier? What do you think?
1990s.
90s? Yeah.
40s?
The 40s? Okay.
I think the 1920s.
20s, okay. So we've got a pretty good span. Sometimes, I asked this once and somebody said like 1780. I was like, that's not fair. That's too early. So it's 1959. So whoever says 60s or something or 50s, that's right on. And this was actually at a conference organized by the oil industry to celebrate its 100th birthday, basically, in the United States. Yeah, it's kind of ironic. And so they had this big conference. It was at Columbia University in New York. And they invited about 4 or 5 keynote speakers. One was the physicist Edward Teller. He's right there. He's known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. He was a big proponent of thermonuclear weapons. And they had him speak, and he gave them this very direct warning about global warming that day. And this is probably the earliest direct warning that we know about to the oil industry about global warming back in 1959. And in this case, I happened to come across this transcript of this conference just while I was in an archive like a year ago. So that stuff, the documents are out there, And just now are we starting to really look for them in a systematic way. Oh yeah, and so if you want to, you can read more about this actually. There's I wrote a piece about this, and you can read about it if you want. Okay. So by the end of the 60s, the situation developed even further. The oil industry started to do its own research about climate change. So by 1968, what's called the American Petroleum Institute, which is the main trade association for the oil industry in the United States. All the big oil companies are part of this group. Commissioned a report on climate change from some scientists, just to report on climate science to the industry internally, sort of privately. And the scientists they hired said this. So there's really no denial of climate change or global warming here. It was pretty well established that if you had CO2 in the atmosphere, that this regulated the Earth's temperature, and if you put more in, you would cause a global warming. It had been established that fossil fuels released a lot of CO2, and that this was starting to accumulate in the atmosphere, and they could tell that that CO2 that was going up in the atmosphere and accumulating was coming specifically from fossil fuels. And so it was a pretty obvious inference that this was going to cause global warming. Now what wasn't known was how much global warming would occur or exactly when it would occur. But even by this time, scientists are saying probably by the year 2000, we'll probably see at least some global warming at this rate. Okay, so in the 70s, I'll skip ahead a little bit. In the 70s, there was a lot of public scientific research on global warming. You've got reports by the National Research Council. You have big assessments that are done. This one's by Jason, which is a sort of secret group of mostly physicists who kind of secretly advised the U.S. government on international security matters during the Cold War. And in this case, they had them do a report on climate change. It's interesting. And so by the end of the 70s, you actually have the industry creating its own internal task force to study climate science and to track it. And so a few years ago, some investigative journalists found the former director of this task force and interviewed him. And it's thanks to that we know a lot more about this research than we would otherwise. So let's take a little look at what they did. So this is just one example. We have quite a few documents from this group, but this is just one example. So this is 1980. They're having a meeting in LaGuardia Airport, like one of those nice lounges, so everybody can fly in and have the meeting. And you've got representatives here from various oil companies. You've got Exxon, you've got Texaco, Standard Oil of Ohio, the American Petroleum Institute, and then their invited guest, which is James Lowerman from Stanford, actually, who is going to talk to them about climate science. And we have his notes so we can know what he told them. But here are his main conclusions. And so he says by 2038, by the year 2038, he expects a global warming of 2.5 degrees Celsius, which is pretty much pretty close to what we see or what we think will happen. And then he traces that out further. He says, so by 2005, we'll see like a 1 degree rise. By 2038, a 2.5 degree rise, and by 2067, a 5 degree rise with globally catastrophic effects, predicts. And even before then, he says there will be major economic consequences from this 2.5 degree rise. So you have quite a blunt warning to the heads of the industry. And remember, this is in 1980, right? About what will happen in the future. Now, there's a question about what should they do about it, and there was a little bit of discussion about should we act, should we change course or not, and we don't know exactly what those discussions were like because we don't have all the evidence yet, but we have some indication, and it looks like there was an understanding that what's called the market penetration time theory, which is how long it takes for new products, new technologies to penetrate the market and take over, is pretty long. It's like 30 or 40 or 50 years often. And they understood that, and so they thought, well, if this is going to happen in the next 50 years, then that means we have to start doing something about this now in order to head off those impacts. So they had an understanding of that then as well. Okay, this is one of my favorites. So this is I'm kind of giving you the highlights. There's a whole bunch of documents, but I like, these are the highlights. So this is 1982, shortly after. This is an internal report from Exxon. And this is like the best figure you could sort of imagine, because it kind of has the whole story. So here on the bottom here we have the year. So this is 1960, and it goes to 2100. So we're about here. And then on this axis, you've got the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And today we're about, what are we, about here? 400 or so. And so that's what this line is. So Exxon is predicting how much CO2 will accumulate in the atmosphere in the future. So it's going up. And then on this axis, you've got the amount of global warming that will occur from a baseline of nothing compared to 1980 to about 3 degrees Celsius. So that's this line. So Exxon is predicting that by about 2050, say, there will be 1.5 degrees of global warming or so. And by the end of the century, if you extrapolate this out, about 3 degrees of global warming. So, I mean, I think there's a really basic conclusion that you can draw from this, which is that in Exxon's mind, in 1982, there is no doubt about whether CO2 will cause global warming. And that's very confidently predicted. And they're not even that uncertain about how much it will cause. They have a pretty good idea about how much global warming will occur and over what time period too. And so somebody found this, and on Twitter oh yeah, I want to say this too. This was like my favorite line from the report. It's like, don't worry, it's not going to be that bad. But it's like, well, that's reassurance, like, yikes. But anyway, somebody took this and they compared this to reality, or what actually happened. So the red is actual and the blue is what Exxon predicted. So you can see in terms of CO2, this is 2018. They're right on. And also in terms of warming, they're also right on. So they predicted the future very accurately. And so you can kind of think of it like we're basically riding up this curve that Exxon predicted back in 1982, before almost anybody was even thinking about this, at least in the public. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And then if you want to read more about this, I wrote this article recently too about that. And if you want to read more about everything, this is such a new area of research that there's not a lot of peer-reviewed literature out yet, because it takes a long time to get peer-reviewed literature out. And so you just have a couple of reports. One is sort of a lot of the early documents from this environmental law nonprofit. And then this is focusing on Exxon, and it's an investigative journalist group looking at the Exxon's climate research in like the 1970s and 1980s. So those are really, really good. I recommend them. Anyway, so that's basically the industry knowledge, like what they knew in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And really, like in that time, there's no climate denial. No one's really saying, oh, climate change doesn't exist, or CO2 doesn't cause climate change, or fossil fuels don't cause climate change. I mean, everybody can basically agree that everybody agreed that those things were true in that time. It was pretty basic science. Now, why do we have such big climate denial today? And where did it come from? And that's part of my research too. Because to beat climate denial, you want to understand where it came from. So really, in the late 80s, there started to be a lot of pressure to do something about global warming and not just study it. So here, this is climatologist Jim Hansen, and he's testifying to Congress, and he's saying, basically global warming is happening, and so we should do something about it. This is back in 1988. And the press picks this up, a lot of attention starts to be put on global warming, and the IPCC gets formed in the late 80s, and their first report comes out in 1990 and says, you know, we're certain that carbon dioxide will cause global warming. Of course, this is like really old science at that time. And they make this chart, and they say this is what we think will happen. And it's kind of funny that like Exxon's graph from like almost 10 years earlier is like more detailed than the IPCC's graph. It's kind of funny. Anyway, so the US starts to be put under pressure to reduce fossil fuel use and enact some policies. And there's the big, the first sort of big UNFCCC conference. And this is the only legally binding international treaty to do something about climate change. So like the Paris Agreement, for example, is not legally binding. And the US isn't part of the Kyoto Protocol, which is legally binding, but the US is not part of that. So this binds the countries to adopt national policies and take measures to mitigate climate change. At least they're supposed to. So there's a lot of pressure. So there's a couple of ways that the industry responded to this pressure. And the first way, and one that you might be familiar with because some people have written about it, is to attack the climate science and make it seem doubtful and uncertain. So here's just a couple of examples. So I'll just let you read that. Okay, so this is like exactly the opposite of what Exxon's internal reports had said, like 15 years earlier. And this is coming from the CEO of Exxon and the chairman of he's also the chair of the API at that time. And of course, compared to what scientists are saying at the time or before, it's completely the opposite, of course.
Could you tell us a little bit more about API?
Yeah, so the API is, it's called a trade association, and it's not a company itself. It doesn't produce anything or sell anything itself, but a lot of different industries have what they call trade associations, and they basically serve the interests of the industry as a whole. So they'll do things like they'll lobby for certain policies, they'll run ad campaigns to promote the product, they'll do PR, they'll coordinate among the companies to kind of make the industry more efficient in some ways. They might do things like have standards and protocols that they put out there for the whole industry's benefit too. And the API is the oldest and the biggest trade association for the oil industry in the United States. So it was founded in 1919. And in reality, it was kind of like, you know, the oil industry in the US at one point was a monopoly run by Standard Oil in the late 1800s. And that monopoly was broken up, I think around 1911 or so, into the daughter companies. And then World War I happened, and the US, as part of the World War effort, brought the oil companies together and said, well, we're going to coordinate you so that you can support the war effort in the best way you can. That was kind of nice in a way, because it kind of allowed the oil companies to operate like a cartel and not really compete with each other. Now after the war ended, the companies were like, now what do we do? Because we kind of like this arrangement. So they created the API in 1919. And so that's sort of like the origin of it. And so today, there are basically two main trade associations for the oil industry. There's the API, which is the main one and represents like the really big companies. Then there's the IPAA, the Independent Petroleum Association of America. And they represent the kind of small companies, the little people. And the API is kind of nice because like if you're investigating what the industry knew about something, if the API knew something, then you can reasonably infer that the main companies knew it too, because they spread information to the other companies. So it's kind of easier than investigating like individual companies. That's why I studied it. So here's another example. Okay, compared to at about the same time, IPCC. And so, you know, this is just a complete denial. It's just saying that, like, look, fossil fuels don't cause global warming. You know, but this is written in Washington Post. So that's a respected newspaper, and a lot of people read it. And this is, like, in a technical scientific report that, like, hardly anybody in the public reads. So that's something to keep in mind. Is like throughout this whole period, the industry is very savvy at public communication, and they're putting their message out in mainstream, respected newspapers. Whereas a lot of times scientists are not doing that. They're putting their message out in scientific papers and so on that very few people read. Yeah.
But certainly the IPCC report was at least reported on in Washington Post.
Yeah, so that would have been reported on. But what you have, especially at this time, was sort of like, it's almost like a he said, she said sort of situation in the press about whether global warming is even real. Now, of course, like that question itself had been, you know, never in doubt for the decades prior, even for the oil companies. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, the media doesn't really report IPCC documents really well. So if you're interested, you could go just 2 weeks ago, there was an IPCC report, and the media reporting of that report is actually not really accurate. So sometimes there's a discrepancy between that two.
Okay, here's the last example. Okay, so again, just kind of flat out denial, and this is, it's called the Global Climate Coalition, but it's actually an anti-fixed climate change group, okay? And it's an industry group that was sort of the main opponent of climate policies in the 90s and early 2000s. It was a coalition of fossil fuel producers, auto manufacturers, petrochemical companies, and other companies that had interest in fossil fuels. And here is actually, so read this and then see where it comes from. The same group, but that's their internal document, and that's their external communication. Pretty big difference. So sometimes we can find these sorts of documents too that really show what they are thinking, and then we can compare that to what they're communicating. Okay, how much time do we have left, by the way?
20 minutes. But like
In the total thing?
Yeah, but
okay.
five.
Okay, let me sort of skip over this, because it's kind of wordy, but it has a really great ending. Okay, we'll do it. So, just read that, and tell me what you think of it. What do you think? Does it make sense? Or no? Maybe yes, maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. Sort of? Okay. Okay, so here's some more of it. What do you think? What's your reaction? Yeah.
I think that's setting the bar a little low.
In what way?
Because, I mean, 10 degrees, a 10-degree increase would obviously have, huge catastrophic, results. And so saying that there's a 95% probability is kind of like obvious. I don't know. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What else did people say? Yeah.
Does that how statistics work?
It's a great question. Yeah, do people kind of follow what they're saying here? They're saying, well, maybe catastrophe will occur at 3 degrees, and maybe it'll occur at 10 degrees. So let's say that there's a 5% chance it occurs at 3 degrees. But that means there's a 95% chance that it won't happen until we hit 10 degrees. So that's kind of nice. We've got some time. Okay, here's the conclusion of this study. Okay, what do you think? Yeah.
Seems like they're basically saying, here are some random numbers, and since these are numbers we picked, look, it's not going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Also, they're kind of ignoring the fact that there are temperatures between 3 degrees and 10 degrees.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, there's no data in here, right? Like, there's no actual research in here. It's just kind of speculative, but even then, it doesn't make a lot of sense logically. But who do you think wrote this study? Exxon? U.S. government? Who wrote this? Who wrote this study? Who did this? It's a Stanford professor. It's a really highly respected Stanford professor paid by a think tank connected to the oil industry to write this study and put it out there. And it gets picked up by the news media. It says, don't worry, you don't have anything to worry about. The Stanford professor said there's nothing to worry about. So it's one thing when, you've got, the chairman or something of the API writing Washington Post saying, don't worry about it. But it's another thing when you have Stanford professors, because their credibility is so high. And industry knows this too. So that's a whole other aspect of it, where you have respected, credible academics being paid by the industry to write these reports that do not undergo peer review. They just get put out there, and then they get reported on. Okay, and there's a lot of this that goes on, and it's kind of fun. Some of these people are around, and you see them on campus, and you're like, I know what you did. Okay, so fine, the last thing I'll say, because we're kind of running out of time, is there's another side to this too, which is it's not just about the science, it's about the economics too. And just like that study that the industry paid for, that's what the industry did with economics too. And so I'll just give one example. So in the early 90s, when these climate policies started to be pushed for, the API hired this economic consultancy to write a report that says climate change, don't worry about it. So climate change won't really hurt you. It's not really going to hurt you anytime soon. If you try to reduce emissions, it's going to hurt even worse. And so just don't do anything about it. Now, these conclusions get communicated and reported in the mainstream media outlets. So the public reads these, they think, oh, this is a respected consulting firm. They're doing the study. Often the source of the funding is not disclosed. It's just a respected economist saying, don't worry about it. Now, sometimes you can actually get the study, sometimes you can't, because a lot of times they're kept secret, like the actual methodology is kept secret. Sometimes you can get them, and you can see that for the most part, these conclusions are just assumed in the study, in the model itself. Like they're the only conclusion you can get. It's not really science, at least I wouldn't say so. But the strategy works. And in fact, last year I had a chance to interview one of the authors of these reports, and this is what he told me. even the authors themselves, or at least this author, is saying this isn't really like kosher. I guess is the way to put it. They're saying the American Petroleum Institute just hired us because we gave them the answers that they wanted. And then they just used those for their purposes. Okay. But the strategy worked. The exact same people were hired by the API again and again, only like 3 or 4 people, to write these reports, and they were used to beat back climate policies in 1993, the Kyoto Protocol, the US involvement in that. There were cap and trade bills in the Senate in the 2000s, again, beaten back with this strategy. And in fact, the report that President Trump cited to justify leaving the Paris Agreement was written by the exact same people as well. And that's actually what made this consultant kind of wonder what he was doing is good. Because he was like, oh God, now I've really done it. Okay, so I tried to make a list of all of the different policies that have been neutralized with this strategy. And this is probably an incomplete list, but I think the point is that society has tried to stop global warming. It's not like we've been sitting around and doing nothing. Tried to enact policies, and they have been beaten back time and time again by, mostly by the industry itself, using these strategies. And that has consequences. This is a study that recently came out about parts of the Bay Area that will be inundated by sea level rise. That's the orange part. And you know, especially things like the airport at Oakland, that's very expensive to move. And so that's why Oakland and San Francisco want some money from the oil industry to help pay for those damages. So just to bring it home, oops. So the history part, we have a lot of evidence of knowledge, of denial, and then of course there's actual harm occurring. And so that's why these cases are being brought, and I'll just leave you with this quote from one of the people doing this work. And so I think this sort of stuff will continue to go on because climate change is not going anywhere, it's only intensifying, and the evidence that we're finding about what these companies knew is also only growing. So I think it'll be really interesting because these are early days, and this is getting big very quickly, which is, I think, exciting. So that's it. So thank you very much. We have time for like some discussion or something like that.
Yeah. So we have 7 minutes left. So if anybody has questions, and we'll be around after too. So feel free to stay. So
Yeah.
we'll leave it to Ben.
So I'm kind of curious, like, what is the next step for your research right now? Or like, what are you in the process of doing?
Yeah. So.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. The question is, what's the next step for my research? What am I in the process of doing? So, for me, it's multiple things. It's part of it is publishing the work because we have a lot of documents, but a lot of them are not in the public domain. We haven't published them yet, and it's so easy for academics to just sit on stuff forever. So that's one thing I'm trying to do is just get stuff out there. And in fact, I think in the next month or so, there will be a piece out in Nature Climate Change that has some new documents. And a lot of those documents are found by traveling around, going to archives, and going through stuff and seeing what you find. So I do that a lot too. So like a couple months ago,